Before we start, I want to thank our sponsor, Kyndryl, who runs and reimagines the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find Kyndryl at kyndryl.com. Today's guests have spent years trying to understand one of the most dramatic collapses in modern business. Nokia's fall from world leader to also ran in the space of just a few years. Their research goes deep inside the organization at the very moment the smartphone era arrived. And what they found is not a lack of intelligence, nor talent, nor even strategy. It was emotion. Top leaders were gripped by fear of Apple, Google, and the judgment of shareholders. Middle managers were gripped by fear of something else entirely, the reactions of their bosses and colleagues. That mix of fears distorted what people saw, what they did, and what they dared to share. Critical warnings were softened or never spoken. Optimism trumped honesty. The snow was melting at the edges, but the center never felt the heat. The result was a company that could not integrate the information it actually had, could not face the scale of the threat it faced, and drifted into short-term fixes while long-term innovations slipped. It's a remarkable story because it shows how organizations don't just lose to competitors, but sometimes lose to themselves. As they wrote, who killed Nokia? Well, Nokia did. Today we're joined by the scholars who uncovered this emotional anatomy of decline. Their work helps us understand not only Nokia, but any organization where fear shapes what gets said, what gets heard, and what gets ignored. It's a pleasure to welcome the authors of a 2016 paper called Distributed Attention and Shared Emotions in the Innovation Process, How Nokia Lost the Smartphone Battle. Chaired Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, Quy Huy, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Aidan. It's a pleasure to be at the show.
And Professor of Strategic Management at Aalto University, Timo Vuori, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Aidan. Great to be here.
As an overview of what's to come, in part one, we're going to cover how this thing, emotions, affects strategy and decision-making inside organizations. And in part two, we'll cover the rise and fall of the telco king Nokia. And then finally, in part three, we'll cover Nokia's Phoenician rise from the ashes, which so few people realize. It's a remarkable story. Let's get stuck in. But first, let's understand this idea of emotions and how it impacts strategy in the first place.
I found that in private interviews, CEOs are very emotional, but they have to hide it and to show very calm, unemotional postures or even passionate when they had to deal with the public of their own employees. So I discovered these double lives, so to speak. But what surprised me is when I interviewed the middle managers, they experienced the same thing. So everybody is hiding emotions from everybody else and using a facade of technology, finance to talk to people as if that's the only thing. And in the end, people were sabotaging each other. So the story which I did in my thesis is not very different. On the thesis that we report on Nokia is almost very common. It's so common that it's puzzling. And even today, when I teach that to hundreds of executives in the last 15 years, they all told me that they're facing the same thing, which is even more surprising. So I think that's how we discover that emotions do matter, not for your love life or your family, but it does matter for strategic performance. And that's what I and Timo started this project into researching more to discover how and why this could happen.
Why we very often take actions that are harmful or suboptimal for us, even when we have access to the best information. And in the Nokia case, when I spoke with the CEO, he was saying how people told him things that he wanted to hear, and he wanted to believe in those things that they told him. So they ended up making decisions that in retrospect were like very wrong decisions. And on the other hand, people told him things that he wanted to hear because the middle managers, they feared that if I tell him that his idea will not work, he's gonna punish me. So they created this huge gaps in information flow and thinking. And this is how I think emotions often come really central to decision making, because they make us really like some options and they make us really pay attention to some information and hide other information.
What I found so interesting was where in the interviews, and we'll share some of the outputs of those interviews that you did, was how the way people reported how they saw things from where they sat inside the company. And we mentioned before we came on air, Joe Bauer, who's a hero of the show, has been on the show. And on his episode, he mentioned this thing called Miles's Law, which is where you stand depends on where you sit. So your perspective of where you are in the company flavors your decision making, how you see things, your perception of the world. But also what I learned from your paper is so does your emotions that come from that. So the decision making, the communication channels, etc., have a dramatic effect on how you show up and where you put your attention. So I have a little quote here. You said, though the generation of structural channels to enable interaction between groups such as top and middle managers might foster comprehensive information sharing between them, the mere existence of such channels may not be sufficient, as people may still avoid bringing up sensitive issues or refuse to listen to others during their interaction episodes. That echoes what Timo just said, because you said several case studies have described the challenges of companies using various structural arrangements and have alluded to the persistence of poor mutual understanding between top and middle managers in the innovation process. One of the really interesting ones was you mentioned President Obama, who said, "I would not have launched healthcare.gov if I had known it wasn't going to work," while many managers in his own team seem to have been long aware that the platform had massive problems. And that just shows you that when I read your work, I was like going, this is still everywhere. This problem that the leadership team goes, we're all over this. Maybe they're reporting to the board or shareholders, we're all over this. Nokia CEO did. And meanwhile, down in the trenches, nothing's been done, or it's been done poorly, or people are doing other things because they're being told that by their managers. I'd love you to build on that, because that seems to me the crux of so many problems in so many companies, in many relationships even.
I would start with the huge contribution by Joe Bauer, which I respect a lot as my senior colleague of Harvard. And it's true that what is where you sit and what you pay attention to. So that is the first step. But however, our research points to a second more addition to that nuance, is that depending on what may not be reported truthfully to other people who could have benefited from that, what you have seen, okay? Because of many assumptions, not every information that you be sharing, you make assumptions that it may not be appreciated, because you make assumptions that it would be going against the expectations, aspirations of the higher up, of the more powerful people. It makes a great discomfort among these people. So how do you feel by sharing to the right people is a huge challenge in organizations.
As a middle manager, you often only see what the supervisor is asking and what colleagues in another department are doing, but you don't see, for instance, customer preferences or what competitors are doing in other companies. So for you, the emotions are just related to surviving the company internal political game and getting ahead in that and satisfying your boss in the middle management. While in top management, you often could see the board pressure or the competitors' strategies. So you feel very different emotions and feel very different threats. And then because you feel these emotions, you also make those assumptions about what others want to hear or what you should do. And that creates these mismatches in communication.
It's a big one, because what you're saying there as well is, say, for example, the show. So mostly when I get sent a book, for example, and I mostly cover books on the show, you also get sent a list of questions to ask the author. And I always think about, that's the cheat sheet. And I would go, how does this person know what I think is interesting to me? Because when you read more and you've read the work of Joe Barry, you've studied that work, it makes every time you do that, it's like a new lens. And I literally see your work differently because I see it through all the lenses of everything I've read before. So their decisions on the questions I should ask are totally different from the questions I do ask at the end of the day. And what was interesting about reading your paper was then there's the emotional thing as well, because I do understand from being an executive in an organization, the emotions of the challenges of you're constantly bumping into resistance. And I look for little quotes and stories that reflect my own experience of that as well. So it really made sense to me. And I thought about how since Frederick Winslow Taylor days, we have broadly considered organizations as machines and the people working in organizations as cogs in the machine. And as a result, work in general is mechanistic. And you were saying this, Quy and Timo, when you worked as engineers, that's what you were valued for. But you tell us, while some scholars pointed to the importance of the humanistic approach, there lacks a deeper and more holistic understanding of the innovation process, including emotions, and hence your investigation into how both emotional reactions and what's called bounded rationality influence the innovation process and its outcomes. I thought that was important to just spell out this idea, the joint investigation, first of all, into Nokia, but these two things, the emotional reactions and bounded rationality.
And I like the comparison to the assembly line and emotional dynamics. So in that era, the work descriptions were very strict. So people were unwell and suffering at work, but because their tasks had been mechanically prescribed, that emotions didn't harm the performance that much. But I think now in the innovation process where you need to be creative and communicate, and you always have some autonomy and expertise, so what you're paid for, the emotions have much more room for influencing what engineers and managers and innovators end up doing. And that's why, as a leader, when you design the organization and its structures, it would be very useful to think about, first and foremost, which kind of emotions and drive and motivation will this process create? Because that's what drives the people to innovate or not.
And that if I could elaborate on that, I think most managers and leaders implicitly aware of the importance of emotions because after all, we were born with emotions as babies. But over time, people learn to master this language under a more, let's say, politically correct language or more socially acceptable language, such as identity or culture or leadership or engagement or motivation. The real substrate, the real DNA of all these words, a huge dimensions emotion, but people do not want to mention this word because it's not politically acceptable. And in our language, in the business language, especially in the business language, I have heard one of the top chairman of the board of the Big Bang who told me, because he knew about my research focus, and he told me a few years ago that Professor Quy, whoever on the board mentioned the word emotion will be fired immediately. We do not tolerate emotion as a topic, a legitimate topic of discussion on the board. We have more important things to worry about. Right? So that single statement captures a lot of the mindset behind it. So people use the word culture, identity, self-stuff, all of this one, the engagement, as a cognitive. They are very cognitive terms, but they are logical and professional terms.
There's a great line, actually, Quy, that you write in the paper, and I just thought I'd share it. Firstly, for so many people who are listeners to the show, working as entrepreneurs, say, trying to drive change with inside organizations, or like many of those Nokia engineers, many of the people working there, that they were trying to do what they thought was best for the organization, but they constantly met resistance. And that's because everybody has their competing, literally, agendas, or where their emotions are directing their attention. And you wrote that innovators are trying to create things that do not yet exist by leveraging technological components of uncertain market potential. Because of this perspective orientation, future-oriented emotions such as hope and fear are particularly likely to arise. Another reason that we might expect fear to be central to innovation is that other past-oriented negative emotions that people may feel during the innovation process, such as shame or envy, can turn into fear. I thought that was so important to realize, because so many people who work in innovation feel it's personal, that people are attacking them, but it's based on the emotions that are driving that the behavior for the person.
Yeah. And if you allow me, you can put all those emotions in the current context of AI, right? All the AI about hope and fear and hype and envy, that AI will replace us as a profession. Fear, envy, shame, guilt are all present, right? And it's all those cognitive emotions again facing technical AI. And I think that's in part explains, I think I'm not saying it's not everything, but it explains in part why the adoption by organizations of AI it has been so poor. Now, they said that there's a recent research that says that 70% of AI initiatives have generated zero profit, zero profit, and the people has invested money, right? And people say, oh, it's the usual resistance to change. So I think we are back to the same thing as Nokia with the smartphone, but maybe at a bigger scale.
But that's the point. Mark Twain quote, history doesn't repeat, but it often does rhyme. And I think that, it's one of the reasons why I think this paper should be certainly resurfaced, if not made very popular in the first place, because it has so many echoes of the past and the future, which is even more important. Timo, were you going to come in there?
Yeah, I think I agree on the AI point, and Nokia really faced a huge disruption with digital platforms, and now the same is happening in pretty much every company with AI. And I'm again teaching the Nokia case almost every week in different companies. And one of the most important insights for people is that it really is a structural and technological thing that generates these emotions. So when an individual manager or engineer sees that, hey, it's because of first the hierarchical structure of the firm that I pay attention to these elements, and then the kind of person at the industry level, why it feels so threatening that I feel these emotions that make me behave in a potentially suboptimal way. When they realize that it's not personal, it's not problem in me, but it's a kind of patterned phenomenon, they often are able to talk about it. So actually, I've seen now many cases where by discussing the Nokia case and then asking people to reflect on their own emotions on situation, they create this open discussion and modify the emotions.
As you were both describing this, I was thinking of the old diffusion of innovations curve by Everett Rogers. And I was thinking, actually, you could easily map emotions to that curve, to the different type of emotional state of the person, but not that they're fixed. I think that is probably important as well, that you can show a different emotion in different aspects of your life. So you could be a different person in work than you are in your private life, etc. And it also depends on the experiences you have. And I think that's what you're getting at here with the past-oriented negative emotions. Say, for example, one of the things I read, which maps to what your writing is about, is if you experienced your parents losing their job, for example, in 2008, 2009, as a younger child, you're going to be more risk averse in the jobs that you pick. So you're going to look for a safer option in the future. And I thought that was important to call out that, say, for example, you tried an innovation or you tried a project, it didn't work out as you'd planned, the company black marked you in some way, or you felt shame, or, as you said, are envious of somebody else who succeeded with an idea that you should have done. Those things have a dramatic effect then on your decision making and how you show up in an organization.
Exactly. And then if I can build on your point, Aidan, and then those emotions, they are real. You feel it. But because of social pressures, it's not cool to talk about it. It's not, you cannot go, you said, you just keep it to yourself like a very cool person. Put it in your side. And you never have time to really process it because it's not cool to process it. And you can distract yourself with all the jobs, all the busy life, your life goes on. But those emotions still stay with you and they will wake up at the moment where you don't like them to wake up. Right. And then you have to fight with your own shadows of the past, which we all experience it in a sense. The ghost of
the Carl Jung shadow of the organization. But there was another interesting one you talked about, which was your status. So again, I'm asking our audience here, think about yourself if you work in an organization. The guy's right here. People's status also influences the emotions they experience. In particular, low status people may have a hardwired, evolutionary-based fear of high status people because in the past, individuals with higher status would have controlled resources critical for survival. And I thought there, Quy, of Joe Bauer's resource allocation process. That's where this shows up, is because higher status people can make decisions because they have actually resources to allocate in the first place.
Yes, I think your point is very relevant. And I like to connect it to a very common phenomena that affects most senior leaders. And I call this the trap of power. The trap of power that links to resources. So how this define power is that power is somebody who has resources, but that other people wish to have. Either status, money, fame, whatever you call it. Something that you wish to have, but the other person can give it to you in part. And that's what the other person has power. Now, so how is it doing to emotions? Usually when you do a major change, the high status people, meaning the higher up, are very good at paying attention to the emotions of people who have more resources than they are, meaning higher power, right? Meaning that the CEO would pay attention to the prime minister, to the minister, to the key board members, to key investors, because they have power, they have resources, right? So they are very emotionally intelligent, super emotionally intelligent in behaving, in dealing with those higher power people, because they can give them resources. But the same CEO can be very dismissive and autocratic and maybe brutal, inhuman with people who are lower than they are because they believe that they have less status and therefore less power and less resources. Why should I pay attention to the emotions of people who are weaker than I am? So that's why I say emotional intelligence is not an issue. It's issue of when a person decides to pay attention to the emotions of other people to achieve a certain goals or not. I go after trap of power. But that is, again, it could be a false assumption because most of leaders who implement change do not pay much attention to the emotional people below them. And usually they got the unpleasant surprise. They thought they were not important, but in the end were more important than they thought.
On the other hand, great leadership examples are of leaders who really inspire their followers. So even if emotions on average are not maybe appreciated that much among current leaders, there are these positive exceptions who really inspire and use the emotional intelligence to trigger those emotions that drive action. And I always say that emotional skills, it's not about making people feel good, but you use emotional skills to really drive action and innovation. So you want to generate beneficial or instrumental emotions among the organization members. And that's just as hard or even manipulative as any other kind of incentive scheme.
When I was reading your work, serendipitously, I was doing a workshop for a senior leadership team on vision, mission, purpose. And when I read about this, I was like, because there's a key line here. You write, just as group members may share similar mental models, they may also share similar emotions. And I went, actually, what part of the whole idea of creating a vision, mission, purpose, mission statement for a team is also that evokes an emotion and that they share that emotion. So it's like a brand. When you look at a brand, that brand might evoke a certain way you feel or a story in your head about the brand, and you don't even think about it because that's good marketing or good advertising. But this was really important. That's what you're trying to actually ultimately get in a team. But as an organization gets bigger, like Nokia did, different product units or different middle managers versus top managers all have different emotions depending, again, on that Miles's law, depending on where they sit.
And it's important that often leaders know that they need to generate the inspiring emotions and they need to generate mission and vision and manage the culture. But where they fail is that they don't recognize also the formal processes and product decisions and resource allocations decisions and communication channels generate emotions. And often it's the unintended side effects of their other decisions that generate the harmful emotions, while they at the same time try to inspire people with vision and mission. And I think where our first paper about attention-based view, the key insight really is that you can think about the whole structure as a mechanism that generates emotions. And when you understand that, you can optimize the structure to generate beneficial emotions. But then as a leader, you cannot delegate emotion management to HR in some other building, but you have to think about it yourself when you think about the full hard substance of the strategy.
I like to elaborate on Timo's important point. And there's an English statement that says, actions speak louder than words. And that means that it's not about you making nice speeches about passion, vision, and how inspiring we should be or how aspirational we should be, that people will really believe in it. Because there's too many good speakers these days. And then people would like to really put in another English statement that said, put your money where your mouth is. Meaning, that it is in the real action. So where the actions really cost you something, such as putting money in research and development when the company cannot afford it or could barely afford it, but you can still believe that for the long-term need, you should keep the percentage R&D high, despite, let's say, maybe less profit margin. And those first words here, people said, what's emotional about it? But in fact, it's very emotional, right? Because people said you are really making a sacrifice. So when push comes to shove, when the sacrifice be made, you make a decision that is painful to you because you'll be losing maybe your bonus, because you will not get your profit. But I said, I'm doing that because I believe in it for the long term. I put like 65% of my budget in R&D, even though we could only afford 1%. So I think those type actions, which looks on the surface very left-brain, very rational, in fact, has a huge collective emotional impact because people appreciate that. And then that's the example that the library to go with. That's the structured attention, what you pay attention to, or put your money where your mouth is.
The hard decisions and then also kind of concrete practices. One thing that didn't make it to the publication, but what many of the Nokia middle managers told was that they weren't allowed to use iPhones when they were working at Nokia, or it was strongly discouraged. And the R&D was in Finland mainly, but you couldn't use an iPhone in Finland in the first years. So they didn't have concrete experience of using the iPhone. And they were under the illusion that Nokia phones are just as good as the iPhone. The story goes that at Samsung, the 100 most important managers were forced to use the iPhone so that they would really learn and feel it. But I've taken this also as a kind of my standard advice in emotion management, that make your employees or the whole organization use the competitors' products daily so that they constantly feel the kind of pressure and want to innovate better. Let's say in a food company that I worked with, they had in their headquarters cafeteria, they were serving only their own products. And of course, the employees were thinking, we have to make the best food. But then I wanted them to, no, you should start serving the competitors' latest products. And then they immediately started understanding that, hey, we need to constantly innovate better to catch up and go further. But no one had to say anything about emotion or give any speeches. You just change the practices to create structure that channels attention to the information that creates the most optimal emotion.
And from emotional perspective, I guess we all know, so what are the underpinning emotions? In the sense, fear and envy can be very constructive. In that just the example that you just made. Fear of your competitors' superiority or advance progress, and envy that they would do so well. Those negative emotions, we don't want to talk about negative emotions, but negative emotions managed and channeled can become force for good, quote unquote.
Indeed. And like we say in the paper, actually, in Nokia, the problem wasn't fear per se, but rather that the fear that was generated by Apple was channeled through the top managers to the middle managers, and the middle managers ended up fearing the top management rather than Apple. So that's why for middle managers, it was okay that I will lie to the top manager, then I'm fine. But of course, when they lost to Apple, because it didn't address the true cause.
Yeah. And to elaborate at this point, and maybe the point it may be clear, but sometimes it's subtle, the paper, is that it's not fear itself that is bad, right? It is because fear can be good under certain circumstances, as we just discussed. In the case of Nokia, it was the misaligned fear that was the root cause. Because top managers were fearful of the target, which is the iPhone and Apple, while middle managers are not afraid of the iPhone, Apple, but are afraid of the top managers. This is the misaligned target of fear that is the root cause of the whole catastrophe, not fear itself. That is a very subtle point, but I think it's a very important point.
Timo, what you said reminded me of that saying that you have to eat your own cooking, but don't only eat your own cooking. You eat other people's cooking, and don't drink your own Kool-Aid only. Drink other people's Kool-Aid. But there's a saying by Jack Welch, and I know people have mixed feelings about Jack Welch as a leader, but he said if the rate of change on the outside exceeds the rate of change on the inside, the end is near. And that quote constantly came to mind because I worked in a very archaic organization for a while, and I saw this where the speed of change was internally focused by most people. And then you had some people who had an eye on the outside world and were going, we are way off the pace here. And when they shared that back into the internal organization, people didn't want to hear it, but also attacked or resisted that message and made excuses the whole time. And I saw this dynamic play out with this paper with the different interviews. And again, that Miles's law, where you stood depended on where you sat in the organization. And I thought we'd share a little bit about that because that is a dynamic that is everywhere.
So in fact, I want to share with you that we have been still teaching 2 cohorts of senior executives a year on strategy execution for innovation. And even after 15 years, I still use the Nokia teach, and the people could fully relate to it. They said, people always said that Professor Quy, what was at Nokia was exactly as our company is today. And the same admission was done widely from Chinese executives to European executives to American executives. There's no cultural differences in regard to that issue. And then, so I think it's this is a problem, but this problem is quite classic, meaning that it's universal and it's still very much current.
And it's a huge challenge. And if you allow for a kind of little analogy, so when you read about the Russian invasion of Ukraine, one of the reasons behind seems to be that no one has dared to tell the President Putin about kind of Russian military limitations in the beginning. At least it can be interpreted that he had a similar illusion of capability and greatness as Nokia leaders had toward Apple. And this story said it's in many companies that we speak that you have the same thing. And I think that's why psychological safety has become such an important concept, because people recognize these constant hindrances in information flow, but we're our paper differs is indeed this structural element. The emotions are not just because your leader is not behaving in the right way, but it's also because where you stand makes you see the world in a different way. And what is important for top management that might not be visible to you at all, and hence you just don't understand why they are upset about something.
I'd like to elaborate on Timo's point about psychosocial safety, because it has been used now for almost all issues. But the fact that we have not been able to implement psychosafety after 40 years of research says something about it's not that easy to do. Point number one. And point number two, I said today, it may be necessary but not sufficient for the following reasons. When I interviewed VP middle managers across all the countries, they said that professor, it's not enough for me to feel psychologically safe to say things. Because what I say, I feel very safe, but what I say does not really matter. The CEO and top management team already made a decision. So they went through this ritual exercise, says, Bob, what do you think? So I say things. Okay, say, nice. Okay, check. Okay, so Timo, what do you think? So Timo can express these things. Okay, thank you. Check. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for sharing your opinion. This is our decision. The people said, my point, I can feel safe, but my point does not matter. It does not matter at all. So next time, I will not go into that kind of ritual exercise because it's a waste of time. So to my point that you feel significantly safe is necessary, but you have to feel valued. You have to feel valued expressing your opinion, because more and more people say, no, psycho safe, when you can say anything you want, but it does not matter. That's what they say.
And as a leader, then you need to really be open to learn about how the reality really is. And I think here we again come back to partly to emotion, that leaders, when they generate their vision or decisions, and then they do this mandatory involvement of people, but if they have already fallen in love with their own idea, they can listen to ideas and then ignore them and just keep pushing them. And I guess they ignore the ideas when they don't feel threatening. If the idea is something that is truly threatening, like the iPhone against Nokia, then it triggers defensive emotional reaction in the leader, and they react in a hostile way toward the person who shares the information. Like in our paper, the Nokia top managers told how verbally abused the McKinsey consultants who first told them about the iPhone threat. So they hired McKinsey to tell them the truth, and then when they told them the truth, they kicked their ass.
I can't remember who this saying was by. It's like, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. But there's so much in this where, Quy, when you were saying about the psychological safety being a panacea, there's also, Timo, you said about you tell the leader. So you have a forum, your view is welcome, even if it's not what we want to hear. You share that. And even worse than being aggressively or visibly being reprimanded or seeing a resistance to my suggestion is when, and I've seen this, where a leader will walk out of the room and go, yeah, I thought Timo was very negative in that meeting, did you think? And starts to label you subtly. And then, of course, you don't have people who are going to stand up and go, no, I think he was very right there, actually, boss. Because they're afraid of the power, and then they subtly poison that person, and then that person is excluded or ostracized or eventually removed from meetings, finds themselves in a position where they're not doing as much productive work as they used to, and they leave the organization. That's a subtle version of the same thing that's probably very common.
Yes, this is very common, because when I talk to senior executives, there is a belief that they compare a strategy, execution, innovation as a war game, that you are in war. At war, everybody has to be united. You cannot express any doubt. So people who express any doubt is perceived as being somewhat uncommitted or disloyal.
Yeah.
Okay, we need a very strong team, and we have to push through it no matter what. And that has been more and more of the mindset these days, because of so much uncertainty and so much doubt. So dissent is not appreciated.
And it's what Nokia CEO said even in the paper, that even when he himself doubted the Nokia strategy, he couldn't say that aloud, and he compared himself to a general going into a battle, that you cannot say that we have lost this battle, you just cheer your troops forward and hope for the best. But yeah, there's this kind of, when you're in a battle, you need to focus on winning. And I guess in some situations you need this unified action. But in business, often it's not so urgent that you wouldn't have time for a brief reflection. So I think this false sense of urgency that we must all act all the time in a united way prevents many organizations actually to fine-tune the strategy implementation to its optimal level. And this way of undermining the critical voices. In the paper, Nokia had that as well. One initiative was called Cancer, that is spreading inside Nokia, and one software manager, vice president, was labeled as a lunatic, and when they challenged the management. But what I really think it's that goes to ambition level in the end. So if you have a leader who is highly ambitious in strategy execution, in the sense that they want to implement the strategy in the best possible way, that kind of leader would probably welcome every suggestion that, hey, we can make this even better if we take this into account.
And I also elaborate on now on my current research, and this has been quite a common phenomenon in the last few years, is that both the top and middle managers was now playing what they call a poker face game. Exactly the point. Poker face game that, the top managers is trying to fake conviction, enthusiasm about the strategy. That, if we work hard, we sacrifice, we cut costs, we work faster, then we'll succeed. Okay. And middle managers, the VP, the vice president, senior vice president, they knew deep down it's not possible. But they had to play the poker face game. Said, yes, boss, you are very right. We are all with you. We are very enthusiastic. So this is, from the emotional perspective, a double emotional faking game. Both are playing extremely well because both of their positions, both are like the very skillful actors. From the emotional perspective, they are very skillful emotional actors, both of them. So they engage in this kind of game to try to deceive each other. They're not even sure what kind of cards the other guys have, you see? And in the end, at least in the Nokia situation.
In the Nokia case, it was so extreme that it's a kind of relief to hear that. So when you are in your own firm, that, hey, this is happening to us as well. And Kui's example reminded me of how Olli-Pekka, the CEO, told that when he was in this panel in 2008, so 2 years before he was fired, and Google CEO said something like, in a couple of years' time, these displays, and he was holding a phone, will add no value, that all the value will be in the cloud. And privately, Olli-Pekka was thinking that, oh shit, like Nokia is doomed, the Google strategy will destroy us. Because he was in a public panel, he had to maintain the poker face. So he was saying like something that this is going to be a great value-adding internet economy and we will all thrive together. And then the employees had to play along as well. But you could actually see evidence that it was really a poker game for everyone, because when McKinsey did their organization health survey among the top and middle management at Nokia, they got the worst result they have ever measured in any company. So it was really the kind of culture and trust in the future of the company, or confidence in the future of the company, was super low, even though everyone was speaking confidently.
What you were talking about there about the acting, putting on this poker face, and I thought about the Greek word persona. So it comes from the Greek word for a mask, and it was the time where people wore a mask as they were one actor, and then they changed masks to change different roles. So that's the origin of persona. But I often think about that for, say, somebody who is neurodivergent, maybe autism, for example, that they sometimes have to mask, and it uses a huge amount of personal energy, of life force. And I thought about that, where if you're doing that, if you're playing that game, it has a dramatic effect literally on your health, not just the organizational health as a metric, but personally, you carry so much weight with that, and you cannot be innovative when you're using all your energy just to get through the day.
Yeah. I think you're right about this one. And I think one of the puzzle these days, as you can see in much of the developed world, but also in China and South Korea today, there's a massive number, like up to 30% of people in the age working group who are professionals. I'm talking about low-level workers, professionals, managers between 25 to 40 years old, who can no longer work, who said that they cannot get out of bed because they cannot bring themselves to work because they feel completely de-energized, right? And maybe a hypothesis would be very much due to that emotion masking that has been going for so long. And I think the young generation has said, how long can we play this faking game? And what's the point of it?
And I think the recent discussions about toxic positivity is really related to this phenomenon. So what I hate most when teaching about emotions is that many managers believe that emotion management is about making everyone feel happy and show happiness and positive emotion, but that's completely wrong. That's like and I say it's the kind of positivity in the North Korean style, if that's allowed in here. But so mental health issues, plus also because it's consuming cognitive capacity, you don't have vital energy for innovation. So it's not only that you get ill over time, but you also can't do your best work.
Yeah, because if you feel it yourself, you are fake. You are a fake person. And he said, what's the point of being a fake person? Why I'm doing this? For money or for career. And then that thing start to lose meaning over time. And maybe that explains in part why there's such a increasing percentage of professional managers educated highly from universities now who feel de-energized, could not even go to work.
I thought when I was reading this about the conformity studies by Solomon Asch in the 1950s, and he studied the phenomenon of conformity in groups. So what they did was they had a group of 10 people, 9 of them were Confederates. They were in on the study, and they had to look at a set of lines and say, what line does the size of this line conform to on the left here? And it would be A, B, or C. And people purposely, because they were actors, would choose the wrong line. And they were studying one person in this group, and the person would, in a majority of cases, say a line that they knew was wrong. Like they knew the answer was wrong. And interestingly, then they interviewed them afterwards and they go, why did you do that? And they were like, I didn't want to be the person who rocked the boat, or I didn't want to be the person who went against the grain, or I just assumed they knew better than me and I just saw it wrong. And I saw that in your paper many times where people knew that the information they were sharing was wrong up the pipe to people, but they did it anyway. And I thought that was an important thing to just call out, this, like the many reasons and the many emotions that led to those decisions.
So I would build on that one as well. And sometimes when I teach the case of Nokia to many executives, the conclusion is that what you guys describing is what happens in organization. The only thing's difference is the outcome is not as extreme. That's all the only difference. That's it. But the point is the same. So that's point one. Point two is that I try to relate that this case is much more generalizable than you think. So I use the case of Boeing 737 MAX. The explosion of Boeing 737 has a much more, let's say, from the human casualties, much more serious than Nokia. And if you read the U.S. Congress report about what happens, Boeing has been knowing exactly the same thing as Nokia for the last 10 years, but nothing was being done until they had to sacrifice a few hundred people to finally to get that. So that is a tragic, but it's exactly the same kind of emotional mechanism were at place against in Boeing, if you read the case, right? Same thing with Samsung explosion of Notepad 4, if we remember that time. Some explosion of Notepad 4, the battery exploded, and people at the airport, people say please do not carry your Notepad 4 on the airplane because you could have the whole plane can explode. And then, so that was something. And if you study why, same similar situation as Nokia. Okay. And the last point I am to use, just to show that happens in all countries, is not because of any kind of special situation, was what they call the German Volkswagen Dieselgate. You remember Dieselgate, where German engineers cheated the system, the emission engine, and for 10 years, brought the same cheating system to the US. When the US discovered that 10 years later, and they had to pay a huge fine and they had to go to jail. Investigation, similar phenomenon of emotion happening there. Fear of pressure, then you cheat, and not to count the countless frauds in banks. The pressure to make money, and no, I'm not going to go into banks because there's so many examples of that.
Maybe what we should finish on is we'll tee people up for the next episode, because we said we'd share emotions, then we'll get into the rise and fall, and then the rise again as part 3. When you teach these cases, what you're really trying to do is teach these executives. And what is maybe one question that you leave them with to try and get them to go, now over to you. How do you make sure you are not encouraging this wrong culture, or a culture where people don't feel they can speak up?
For me, I set up in my teaching, there are the 2 sections. This one session is called bad news, like we will do today. Because some executives they're asking me, they're challenging me, say, Professor, how much would it cost us if we don't pay attention to emotion? Can you quantify a business case, that how much would I lose if I don't pay attention to emotion? So that's the case of Nokia. That's only $100 billion. I don't know if it's big enough or small enough for you. So it's only 100 billion euros. Today would be worth 500 million euros. I don't know whether it's good quantification is enough. So that's my this is my cheeky answer. But I said, but more seriously, I said, that today is the bad news. Today is a bad news session, and next time I will give you the solution. Things can be very different.
I actually introduce emotions when I did strategic decision making or strategy implementation. So I actually show the executives how you can reflect on and recognize emotions in different parts of the decision making process. So we would do like an environmental scanning. What are the major shifts in the environment? How they impact us? And then third question, how does that make me feel? And then they start reflecting on them. And often they find that super helpful. And when they share them out loud, they are surprised that others have same emotions. So it's secretly lure them into emotions, and then they find it very beneficial. Then they start using it.
I just want to share something that's similar to Timo. I teach a very long session to C-level on strategy execution. So in the sense, we go trick them that way, that we are going to go in strategy execution. So they said, yes, we go to and expect to read about the structure, KPI, alignment, and we just do that. And then the day 2, you talk about emotions and Nokia. And we didn't expect that. But in the end, we like it. But that's not something we expected. About a course of strategy execution. We expect structure, incentives, KPI, all of this, project management.
I think that's why I was attracted to this work, is that I can see that, and it's not what many people think. So when they think about strategy, they don't think about this stuff. But this is almost like the foundation to build a strategy on top of. You have to have a solid, emotional and psychologically safe environment for people to be able to perform at their best and be strategic in the first place. Guys, for people who want to reach you, where's the best place to find you, Quy?
I think I could be reachable easily on the INSEAD website. So just type in my name, INSEAD Faculty Strategy, and there's a lot of information about me, or just Google me, just Google my name, INSEAD, and there's a lot written about me and my work.
And I will share links also to some of the articles and how I found you in the first place as well. And Timo, for people who want to find you?
I'm very active on LinkedIn, so Professor Timo Vuori in LinkedIn. I share videos almost weekly. And then I have also my own website, adaptivevolcano.com, which comes partly from my last name, which in Finnish means mountain.
Professor of Strategy at INSEAD, Quy Huy, thank you for joining us. And Professor of Strategic Management at Aalto University, Timo Vuori, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, it has been great.
Thank you, Aidan. It's a pleasure.
As always, thank you to our sponsor, Kyndryl, who run and reimagine the technology systems that drive advantage for the world's leading businesses. With a unique blend of AI-powered consulting built on unmatched managed service capability, Kyndryl helps leaders harness the power of technology for smarter decisions, faster innovation, and a lasting competitive edge. You can find our friends at Kyndryl at kyndryl.com.